Chapter 14. Santa Barbara, hide droguing, harbor duties, discontent, San Pedro. After a few days finding the trade beginning to slacken, we hove our anchor up, set our topsails, ran the stars and stripes up to the peak, fired a gun which was returned from the Presidio, and left the little town astern, running out of the bay and bearing down the coast again for Santa Barbara. As we were now going to leeward, we had a fair wind and a plenty of it. After doubling Point Pinos, we bore up, set studding sails alow and aloft, and were walking off at the rate of 8 or 9 knots, promising to traverse in 24 hours the distance which we were nearly 3 weeks in traversing on the passage up. We passed Point Conception at a flying rate, the wind blowing so that it would have seemed half a gale to us if we had been going the other way and close-hauled. As we drew near the islands off Santa Barbara, it died away a little, but we came to at our old anchoring ground in less than 30 hours from the time of leaving Monterey. Here, everything was pretty much as we left it, the large bay without a vessel in it, the surf roaring and rolling in upon the beach, the white mission, the dark town, and the high treeless mountains. Here, too, we had our southeaster tacks aboard again, slip ropes, buoy ropes, sails furled with reefs in them, and rope yarns for gaskets. We lay here about a fortnight, employed in landing goods and taking off hides occasionally when the surf was not high, but there did not appear to be one half the business doing here that there was in Monterey. In fact, so far as we were concerned, the town might almost as well have been in the middle of the Cordilleras. We lay at a distance of 3 miles from the beach, and the town was nearly a mile farther, so that we saw little or nothing of it. Occasionally we landed a few goods, which were taken away by Indians in large, clumsy ox carts, with the yoke on the ox's neck instead of under it, and with small solid wheels. A few hides were brought down, which we carried off in the California style. This we had now got pretty well accustomed to, and hardened to also, for it does require a little hardening even to the toughest. The hides are always brought down dry, or they would not be received. When they are taken from the animal, they have holes cut in the ends and are staked out and thus dried in the sun without shrinking. They are then doubled once lengthwise, with the hair side usually in, and sent down upon mules or in carts, and piled above high water mark. And then we take them upon our heads, one at a time, or two if they're small, and wade out with them and throw them into the boat, which, as there are no wharves, we're usually kept anchored by a small kedge, or keelek, just outside of the surf. We all provided ourselves with thick Scotch caps, which would be soft to the head and at the same time protect it, for we soon found that however it might look or feel at first, the headwork was the only system for California. For besides that, the seas, breaking high, often obliged us to carry the hides so in order to keep them dry. We found that as they were very large and heavy and nearly as stiff as boards, it was the only way that we could carry them with any convenience to ourselves. Some of the crew tried other expedients, saying that they looked too much like West India Negroes, but they all came to it at last. The great art is in getting them on the head. We had to take them from the ground, and as if they were very heavy and as wide as the arms could stretch and easily taken by the wind, we used to have some trouble with them. I have often been laughed at myself, and joined in laughing at others, pitching themselves down in the sand, trying to swing a large hide upon their heads, or nearly blown over with one in a little gust of wind. The captain made it harder for us by telling us that it was California fashion to carry 2 on the head at a time. And as he insisted upon it, and we did not wish to be outdone by other vessels, we carried 2 for the first few months, but after falling in with a few other hide drogers, and finding that they carried only 1 at a time, we knocked off the extra one, and thus made our duty somewhat easier. After we had got our heads used to the weight and had learned the true California style of tossing a hide, we could carry off 200 or 300 in a short time without much trouble. But it was always wet work, and if the beach was stony, bad for our feet. For we, of course, always went barefooted in this duty, as no shoes could stand such constant wetting with salt water. Then, too, we had a long pull of 3 miles with a loaded boat, which often took a couple of hours. We had now got well settled down into our harbor duties, which, as they are a good deal different from those at sea, it may be well enough to describe. In the first place, all hands are called at daylight, or rather, especially if the days are short, before daylight, as soon as the first gray of the morning. The cook makes his fire in the galley, the steward goes about his work in the cabin, and the crew rig the head pump and wash down the decks. The chief mate is always on deck but takes no active part, all the duty coming upon the second mate, who has to roll up his trousers and paddle about decks barefooted, like the rest of the crew. The washing, swabbing, squilging, etc. lasts, or is made to last, until 8 o'clock, when breakfast is ordered fore and aft. After breakfast, for which half an hour is allowed, the boats are lowered down and made fast astern or out to the swinging booms by guess warps, and the crew are turned to upon their day's work. This is various, and its character depends upon circumstances. There is always more or less of boating in small boats, and if heavy goods are to be taken ashore or hides are brought down to the beach for us, then all hands are sent ashore with an officer in the longboat. Then there is always a good deal to be done in the hold, goods to be broken out and cargo to be shifted to make room for hides or to keep the trim of the vessel. In addition to this, the usual work upon the rigging must be done. There is a good deal of the latter kind of work which can only be done when the vessel is in port. And then everything must be kept taut and in good order, spun yarn made, chafing gear repaired, and all the other ordinary work. The great difference between sea and harbor duty is in the division of time. Instead of having a watch on deck and a watch below, as at sea all hands are at work together except at meal times, from daylight till dark, and at night an anchor watch is kept, which consists of only 2 at a time, the whole crew taking turns. An hour is allowed for dinner, and at dark the decks are cleared up, the boats hoisted, supper ordered, and at 8 the lights put out except in the binnacle, where the glass stands, and the anchor watch is set. Thus, when at anchor, the crew have more time at night, standing watch only about 2 hours, but have no time to themselves in the day, so that reading, mending clothes, etc. has to be put off until Sunday, which is usually given. Some religious captains give their crews Saturday afternoons to do their washing and mending in, so that they may have their Sundays free. This is a good arrangement, and does much toward creating the preference sailors usually show for religious vessels. We were well satisfied if we got Sunday to ourselves, for if any hides came down on that day, as was often the case when they were brought from a distance, we were obliged to bring them off, which usually took half a day. And as we now lived on fresh beef and ate 1 bullock a week, the animal was almost always brought down on Sunday, and we had to go ashore, kill it, dress it, and bring it aboard, which was another interruption. Then, too, our common day's work was protracted and made more fatiguing by hides coming down late in the afternoon, which sometimes kept us at work in the surf by starlight, with the prospect of pulling on board and stowing them all away before supper. But all these little vexations and labors would have been nothing. They would have been passed by as the common evils of a sea life, which every sailor who is a man will go through without complaint, were it not for the uncertainty, or worse than uncertainty, which hung over the nature and length of our voyage. Here we were in a little vessel with a small crew on a half-civilized coast at the ends of the earth, and with a prospect of remaining an indefinite period, 2 or 3 years at the least. When we left Boston, we supposed that it was to be a voyage of 18 months, or 2 years at most. But upon arriving on the coast, we learned something more of the trade, and found that in the scarcity of hides, which was yearly greater and greater, it would take us a year at least to collect our own cargo, beside the passage out and home. And that we were also to collect a cargo for a large ship belonging to the same firm, which was soon to come on the coast, and to which we were to act as tender. We had heard rumors of such a ship to follow us, which had leaked out from the captain and mate, but we passed them by as mere yarns till our arrival, when they were confirmed by the letters which we brought from the owners to their agent. The ship California, belonging to the same firm, had been nearly 2 years on the coast, had collected a full cargo, and was now at San Diego, from which port she was expected to sail in a few weeks for Boston, and we were to collect all the hides we could and deposit them at San Diego, when the new ship, which would carry 40,000, was to be filled and sent home. And then we were to begin anew and collect our own cargo. Here was a gloomy prospect before us indeed. The California had been 20 months on the coast, and the Lagoda, a smaller ship carrying only 31 or 32,000, had been 2 years getting her cargo. And we were to collect a cargo of 40,000 beside our own, which would be 12 or 15,000, and hides were said to be growing scarcer. Then, too, this ship, which had been to us a worse phantom than any Flying Dutchman, was no phantom or ideal thing, but had been reduced to a certainty, so much so that a name was given her. And it was said that she was to be the Alert, a well-known Indiaman, which was expected in Boston in a few months when we sailed. There could be no doubt, and all looked black enough. Hence were thrown out about 3 years and 4 years. The older sailors said they never should see Boston again, but should lay their bones in California, and the clouds seemed to hang over the whole voyage. Besides, we were not provided for so long a voyage, and clothes and all sailors' necessaries. We were not provided for so long a voyage, and clothes and all sailors' necessaries were excessively dear. 300 or 400% advance upon the Boston prices. This was bad enough for them, but still worse was it for me, who did not mean to be a sailor for life, having intended only to be gone 18 months or 2 years. 3 or 4 years would make me a sailor in every respect, mind and habits as well as body, nolens volens, and would put all my companions so far ahead of me that college and a profession would be in vain to think of. And I made up my mind that, feel as I might, a sailor I must be, and to be master of a vessel must be the height of my ambition. Beside the length of the voyage and the hard and exposed life, we were at the ends of the earth, on a coast almost solitary, in a country where there is neither law nor gospel, and where sailors are at their captain's mercy, there being no American council or anyone to whom a complaint could be made. We lost all interest in the voyage, cared nothing about the cargo, which we were only collecting for others, began to patch our clothes, and felt as though we were fixed beyond all hope of change. In addition to, and perhaps partly as a consequence of this state of things, there was trouble brewing on board the vessel. Our mate, as the first mate is always called par excellence, was a worthy man, a more honest, upright, and kind-hearted man I never saw. But he was too good for the mate of a merchantman. He was not the man to call a sailor a son of a bitch and knock him down with a handspike. He wanted the energy and spirit for such a voyage as ours and for such a captain. Captain T was a vigorous, energetic fellow. As sailors say, he hadn't a lazy bone in him. He was made of steel and whalebone. He was a man to toe the mark and to make everyone else step up to it. During all the time that I was with him, I never saw him sit down on deck. He was always active and driving, severe in his discipline, and expected the same of his officers. The mate not being enough of a driver for him and being perhaps too easy with the crew, he was dissatisfied with him, became suspicious that discipline was getting relaxed, and began to interfere in everything. He drew the reins tauter, and as in all quarrels between officers, the sailors side with the one who treats them best. He became suspicious of the crew. He saw that everything went wrong, that nothing was done with a will, and in his attempt to remedy the difficulty by severity, he made everything worse. We were in every respect unfortunately situated. Captain, officers, and crew entirely unfitted for one another, and every circumstance and event was like a two-edged sword, and cut both ways. The length of the voyage, which made us dissatisfied, made the captain at the same time feel the necessity of order and strict discipline. And the nature of the country, which caused us to feel that we had nowhere to go for redress, but were entirely at the mercy of a hard master, made the captain feel, on the other hand, that he must depend entirely upon his own resources. Severity created discontent, and signs of discontent provoked severity. Then, too, ill treatment and dissatisfaction are no linamenta laborum, and many a time have I heard the sailors say that they should not mind the length of the voyage and the hardships if they were only kindly treated, and if they could feel that something was done to make things lighter and easier. We felt as though our situation was a call upon our superiors to give us occasional relaxations and to make our yoke easier, but the contrary policy was pursued. We were kept at work all day when in port, which, together with a watch at night, made us glad to turn in as soon as we got below. Thus we got no time for reading or, which was of more importance to us, for washing and mending our clothes. And then, when we were at sea, sailing from port to port, instead of giving us watch and watch, as was the custom on board every other vessel on the coast, we were all kept on deck and at work, rain or shine, making spun yarn and rope, and at other work in good weather, and picking oakum when it was too wet for anything else. All hands were called to, quote, come up and see it rain, end of quote, and kept on deck hour after hour in a drenching rain, standing round the deck so far apart as to prevent our talking with one another, with our tarpaulins and oilcloth jackets on, picking old rope to pieces or laying up gaskets and rowbands. This was often done, too, when we were lying in port with 2 anchors down and no necessity for more than 1 man on deck as a lookout. This is what is called, quote, hazing, end of quote, a crew, end quote, working their old iron up, end of quote. While lying at Santa Barbara, we encountered another southeaster, and like the first, it came on in the night, the great black clouds coming round from the southward, covering the mountain and hanging down over the town, appearing almost to rest upon the roofs of the houses. We made sail, slipped our cable, cleared the point, and beat about for 4 days in the offing under close sail with continual rain and high seas and winds. No wonder, thought we, they have no rain in the other seasons, for enough seemed to have fallen those 4 days to last through a common summer. On the 5th day it cleared up after a few hours, as is usual, of rain coming down like a 4-hour shower bath, and we found ourselves drifted nearly 10 leagues from the anchorage. And having light headwinds, we did not return until the 6th day. Having recovered our anchor, we made preparations for getting underway to go down to leeward. We had hoped to go directly to San Diego, and thus fall in with the California before she sailed for Boston, but our orders were to stop at an intermediate port called San Pedro, and as we were to lie there a week or two, and the California was to sail in a few days, we lost the opportunity. Just before sailing, the captain took on board a short, red-haired, round-shouldered, vulgar-looking fellow who had lost one eye and squinted with the other, and introducing him as Mr. Russell, told us that he was an officer on board. This was too bad. We had lost overboard on the passage one of the best of our number. Another had been taken from us an appointed clerk, and thus weakened and reduced, instead of shipping some hands to make our work easier, he had put another officer over us to watch and drive us. We had now 4 officers and only 6 in the forecastle. This was bringing her too much down by the stern for our comfort. Leaving Santa Barbara, we coasted along down, the country appearing level or moderately uneven and for the most part sandy and treeless, until doubling a high sandy point, we let go our anchor at a distance of 3 or 3.5 miles from shore. It was like a vessel bound to Halifax coming to anchor on the Grand Banks, for the shore being low appeared to be at a greater distance than it actually was, and we thought we might as well have stayed at Santa Barbara and sent our boat down for the hides. The land was of a clayey consistency, and as far as the eye could reach, entirely bare of trees and even shrubs. And there was no sign of a town, not even a house to be seen. What brought us into such a place we could not conceive. No sooner had we come to anchor than the slip rope and the other preparations for southeasters were got ready. And there was reason enough for it, for we lay exposed to every wind that could blow except the northwest, and that came over a flat country with a range of more than a league of water. As soon as everything was snug on board, the boat was lowered, and we pulled ashore, our new officer, who had been several times in the port before, taking the place of a steersman. As we drew in, we found the tide low and the rocks and stones covered with kelp and seaweed lying bare for the distance of nearly 1/8 of a mile. Picking our way barefooted over these, we came to what is called the landing place at high water mark. The soil was, as it appeared at first, loose and clay, and except the stalks of the mustard plant, there was no vegetation. Just in front of the landing and immediately over it was a small hill which, from its being not more than 30 or 40 feet high, we had not perceived from our anchorage. Over this hill we saw 3 men coming down, dressed partly like sailors and partly like Californians. One of them having on a pair of untanned leather trousers and a red beige shirt. When they came down to us, we found that they were Englishmen, and they told us that they had belonged to a small Mexican brig which had been driven ashore here in a southeaster and now lived in a small house just over the hill. Going up this hill with them, we saw just behind it a small low building with one room containing a fireplace, cooking apparatus, etc., and the rest of it unfinished and used as a place to store hides and goods. This, they told us, was built by some traders in the Pueblo, a town about 30 miles in the interior, to which this was the port, and used by them as a storehouse and also as a lodging place when they came down to trade with the vessels. These 3 men were employed by them to keep the house in order and to look out for the things stored in it. They said that they had been there nearly a year, had nothing to do most of the time, living upon beef, hard bread, and frijoles, a peculiar kind of bean very abundant in California. The nearest house, they told us, was a rancho or cattle farm about 3 miles off, and one of them went up, at the request of our officer, to order a horse to be sent down, with which the agent who was on board might go up to the Pueblo. From one of them, who was an intelligent English sailor, I learned a good deal in a few minutes' conversation about the place, its trade, and the news from the southern ports. San Diego, he said, was about 80 miles to the leeward of San Pedro. That they had heard from there by a Mexican who came up on horseback that the California had sailed for Boston, and that the Lagoda which had been in San Pedro only a few weeks before, was taking in her cargo for Boston. The Ayacucho was also there, loading for Callao, and the little Laureate, which had run directly down from Monterey, where we left her. San Diego, he told me, was a small, snug place having very little trade, but decidedly the best harbor on the coast, being completely landlocked and the water as smooth as a duck pond. This was the depot for all the vessels engaged in the trade, each one having a large house there built of rough boards in which they stowed their hides as fast as they collected them in their trips up and down the coast, and when they had procured a full cargo, spent a few weeks there, taking it in, smoking ship, supplying wood and water, and making other preparations for the voyage home. The Lagoda was now about this business. When we should be about it was more than I could tell. 2 years at least, I thought to myself. I also learned, to my surprise, that the desolate-looking place we were in was the best place on the whole coast for hides. It was the only port for a distance of 80 miles, and about 30 miles in the interior was a fine plain country, filled with herds of cattle, in the center of which was the Pueblo de Los Angeles, the largest town in California, and several of the wealthiest missions, to all of which San Pedro was the seaport. Having made our arrangements for a horse to take the agent to the Pueblo the next day, we picked our way again over the green, slippery rocks and pulled aboard. By the time we reached the vessel, which was so off that we could hardly see her in the increasing darkness, the boats were hoisted up and the crew ate supper. Going down into the forecastle, eating our supper and lighting our cigars and pipes, we had, as usual, to tell all we had seen or heard ashore. We all agreed that it was the worst place we had seen yet, especially for getting off hides, and our lying off at so great a distance looked as though it was bad for southeasters. After a few disputes as to whether we should have to carry our goods up the hill or not, we talked of San Diego, the probability of seeing the Lagoda before she sailed, etc., etc. The next day we pulled the agent ashore, and he went up to visit the Pueblo and the neighboring missions. And in a few days, as the result of his labors, large ox carts and droves of mules loaded with hides were seen coming over the flat country. We loaded our longboat with goods of all kinds, light and heavy, and pulled ashore. After landing and rolling them over the stones upon the beach, we stopped, waiting for the carts to come down the hill and take them, but the captain soon settled the matter by ordering us to carry them all up to the top, saying that was California fashion. So what the oxen would not do, we were obliged to do. The hill was low but steep, and the earth, being clay and wet with the recent rains, was but bad holding ground for our feet. The heavy barrels and casks were rolled up with some difficulty. Getting behind and putting our shoulders to them, now and then our feet slipping, added to the danger of the casks rolling back upon us. But the greatest trouble was with the large boxes of sugar. These we had to place upon oars, and lifting them up, rest the oars upon our shoulders and creep slowly up the hill with the gait of a funeral procession. After an hour or two of hard work, we got them all up and found the carts standing full of hides, which we had to unload and also to load again with our own goods. The lazy Indians who came down with them, squatting down on their hams, looking on, doing nothing, and when we asked them to help us, only shaking their heads or drawling out, no quiero. Having loaded the carts, we started up the Indians, who went off, one on each side of the oxen, with long sticks sharpened at the end to punch them with. This is one of the means of saving labor in California: 2 Indians to 2 oxen. Now the hides were to be got down, and for this purpose we brought the boat round to a place where the hill was steeper and threw them down, letting them slide over the slope. Many of them lodged, and we had to let ourselves down and set them a-going again, and in this way got covered with dust and our clothes torn. After we had got them all down, we were obliged to take them on our heads and walk over the stones and through the water to the boat. The water and the stones together would wear out a pair of shoes in a day. And as shoes were very scarce and very dear, we were compelled to go barefooted. At night we went on board, having had the hardest and most disagreeable day's work that we had yet experienced. For several days we were employed in this manner until we had landed 40 or 50 tons of goods and brought on board about 2,000 hides. When the trade began to slacken and we were kept at work on board during the latter part of the week, either in the hold or upon the rigging. On Thursday night there was a violent blow from the northward, but as this was offshore, we had only to let go our other anchor, and hold on. We were called up at night to send down the royal yards. It was as dark as a pocket and the vessel pitching at her anchors. I went up to the fore and my friend S to the main, and we soon had them down, quote, ship-shape and Bristol fashion, end of quote. For as we had now got used to our duty aloft, everything above the cross trees was left to us, who were the youngest of the crew, except one boy.